You know, at first glance, a Game Boy Advance brings back a rush of really specific, innocent memories. The feel of the plastic, the lack of a backlight on those early models, those simpler times. But today, in this explainer, we're going to completely contrast that innocent, colorful appearance of our childhood handheld consoles with the intense, frankly pulse-pounding reality that was actually hidden inside them. Specifically, we're diving deep into the Megaman Battle Network games, really zeroing in on chapters 3 and 5. Because let's be honest, for those of us who were there, these weren't just Saturday morning cartoons in pixel form. Not at all. They were intricate, incredibly high-stakes simulations that pushed young players to their absolute psychological limits.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the deceptive cartridge. Then, we'll look at the architecture of chaos, followed by the twin trials of passage, the evolution of mastery, and we'll wrap it all up with the real-world boon.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the deceptive cartridge. More than just pixels.
To an entire generation of young players, the setting of ACDC Town felt like a vivid, breathing second home. It was wildly relatable. You went to school, you talked to your friends, you walked the quiet streets. But beneath that super cozy domestic facade, the quiet hum of the internet masked a constant, lurking threat. You weren't just exploring a fun digital playground, right? You were staring into a glowing screen, facing a world that felt uncomfortably adult in its realism. When net crimes suddenly targeted public infrastructure, or hospitals, or schools, the stakes instantly crossed a line. It went from a fun, fictional fantasy to a genuine, deeply unsettling sense of danger.
And that brings us to a defining truth about this series. There's a brilliant observation that BN3 and BN5 are not games you play, they are games you endure. Think about that for a second. The crucial point here is that actually completing these narratives required a psychological readiness. It demanded an emotional endurance that pushed young players way, way beyond mere mechanical skill. I mean, you could have the fastest thumbs in the world, but if you couldn't handle the emotional weight and the sheer panic of the moment, those mechanical skills absolutely would not save you.
Let's move on to Section 2, the architecture of chaos, simulating a crisis.
These games were absolute masterclasses in applying environmental pressure. The design actively induced genuine anxiety, simulating a true crisis rather than a standard, predictable gaming challenge. Think about the audio-visual assault, that dissonant, completely panic-inducing alarm music. You know the exact siren I'm talking about. The shifting, corrupted environmental colors, the deep existential dread, and perhaps worst of all, villains who actually succeed in their evil plans before you have a chance to stop them. This wasn't merely an aesthetic choice, it was highly symbolic and intentional. By utilizing blaring sirens in those sickly, glitching red and green environments, the game violently forced the player into an overwhelmed state of emergency response. It wasn't battle music, it was panic music.
And because the villains, groups like World 3 and Nebula, were actively succeeding, the fear was no longer strictly fictional. When the digital corruption began physically bleeding into the real world of the game, making those abstract digital voids feel as real and threatening as a dark, stormy street in your own hometown, the isolation became so palpable. You really felt like you were just a kid, standing completely alone trying to hold back a hurricane.
This is exactly why it's so accurate to define these games as crisis simulators. A crisis simulator is a controlled, digital environment that explicitly demands emotional regulation, immediate action under immense pressure, and a total resilience to failure. In a lot of ways, these titles share a spiritual DNA with intense survival games. They demand that you take action even when your heart is pounding and you are terrified, and honestly, that is the foundational skill of any hero. You had to learn to sit with that dread, steady your hands, and act anyway.
Which brings us to Section 3, the twin trials of passage, identity and leadership.
It is absolutely fascinating to map out this coming-of-age arc across the two games. On one side, Battle Network 3 is fundamentally the trial of identity. It demands personal survival and emotional endurance. You are confronting the incredibly heavy trauma of the Hikari family, and you're forced to master your own fear against the dread of the Undernet, easily the franchise's darkest, most hostile digital zone. But then, on the flip side, Battle Network 5 is the trial of leadership. It completely shifts the dynamic. Now the game requires synergy, trust, and managing the permanent consequences of liberation missions with a team. It's a perfect psychological progression. First, you have to master yourself. Then, you have to master the heavy burden of protecting others.
Let's look at how this played out in the actual boss fights. Take Bubbleman, for instance. He looks like a totally harmless little bath toy, right? Absolutely not. Bubbleman taught patience the hard way. He actively punished the player's instinct to just rush in and mash buttons. By hiding behind rocks and turtling up, he demanded that players wait for incredibly precise windows of opportunity. It completely reshaped your approach to combat, forcing you out of frantic clicking and into calculated, disciplined waiting.
And then there was Kingman. His trial was pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. His chess-inspired battle mechanics challenged the player's mind directly, totally humiliating anyone who tried to rely on brute force. If you couldn't step back, think 3 moves ahead, and adapt to a constantly changing board, you were systematically dismantled. He didn't just challenge the digital weapons or the chips in your folder. He challenged your intellect.
These bosses were essentially your worst fears given form. They were meticulously designed to punish a lack of focus, demanding that the player start treating failure strictly as valuable data. Hesitation? Dead. Poor chip synergy? Dead. A weak folder construction? Immediate defeat. The game was essentially looking you in the eye and saying, "You will not advance until you show me you understand the lesson."
Let's dive into Section 4, the evolution of mastery, from panic to S-rank.
Every single player's journey starts in exactly the same place: reactive panic. You're frantically button-mashing, completely overwhelmed by the blinding speed of the game, and you're probably losing to every boss you encounter. But the game's brutal difficulty mandates a hard transition into calculated dominance. This is that flow state where you begin controlling the pace with pure, executed brilliance, eventually achieving S-rank mastery. It's that beautiful moment where the battlefield stops being a chaotic mess and becomes a living opponent that you actively manipulate.
This is the quiet, beating heart of the entire journey, and it reveals 3 critical steps of growth. First, surviving the madness in that state of reactive panic. Second, taking a breath, stepping back, and utilizing pattern recognition to actually read the underlying rhythms of the enemy. And finally, step 3, entering proactive dominance. That's when you are anticipating threats before they even arrive, completely turning the enemy's own momentum against them. This evolution is so notoriously difficult because navigating these battles is insanely cognitively intense. Think about what you're actually doing. You are required to simultaneously juggle real-time spatial movement on a grid, exact chip timing, predicting enemy attack patterns, and managing your precious custom gauge resources. Doing all of this at once, under extreme duress, is an incredible mental workout for anyone, let alone a 10-year-old playing in the backseat of a car.
Achieving this level of complete, total mastery wasn't something you did in a weekend. It often meant investing well over 100 hours into a single, tiny plastic cartridge. It meant grinding endlessly to defeat the final post-game Omega and version 5 Novice, without question, the ultimate, most punishing hidden bosses in the entire franchise. This was the absolute summit of the Digital Mountain, a space reserved exclusively for the players who had fully internalized every single harsh lesson the game had to offer.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, The Real-World Boon, Timeless Courage.
As we step back and reflect on what all of this really meant for those young players stepping away from the glowing screen, we have to ask the critical analytical question. What do these digital trials actually teach us? Why do some games demand inner strength rather than just testing our hand-eye coordination? And how does surviving a manufactured, pixelated digital crisis actually forge genuine real-world resilience?
Think back to that exact moment, when the credits finally rolled and your Game Boy Advance snapped shut. There was no loud external celebration, right? There was no parade. There was just a deep, incredibly still exhale. That silence represented a monumental inner achievement. It was the feeling of a kid staring down absolute, overwhelming digital darkness and choosing not to blink. It was a deeply private but profoundly real victory.
The real-world takeaways from this are honestly staggering when you lay them all out. You learned strategic discipline over impulse. You learned emotional regulation inside total chaos. You developed the moral courage to face heavy responsibility. You learned the vital skill of treating failure merely as data rather than as a personal defeat. And above all, you developed a stubborn refusal to quit when you were completely overwhelmed. These lessons in problem-solving and perseverance were quietly carried into adulthood. They subconsciously shaped how so many of these players now handle high-stress academics, demanding careers, incredibly complex relationships, and all of life's inevitable, messy unpredictabilities.
Decades later, revisiting these narratives with adult eyes reveals such a beautiful, undeniable truth. The games haven't changed. The code on that cartridge is exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. But the courage it took for a young player to save that digital world was always real. The growth that came from enduring those trials was completely undeniable.
You weren't just leveling up a digital avatar, you were leveling up yourself.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to reflect upon, driven perfectly by this idea. The boss formats change. The instinct to push forward never has to. Think about it. If every overwhelming chaotic obstacle in the net had a pattern that could eventually be learned, broken down, and mastered through patience and discipline, what seemingly impossible patterns in your own real life are you now entirely equipped to conquer? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.